My ex called me at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday in October. I didn't answer. I was awake, which is the part that stays with me. Not the call itself, but the fact that I was lying in the dark with my phone face up on the nightstand, and I watched her name light up the screen, and I made the specific decision not to pick up. I watched it ring 4 times and then go to voicemail, and I watched the screen go dark again. And I lay there in the October dark, thinking about why she would be calling at 3 a.m. and whether I should call back, and deciding that I would decide in the morning. And then somewhere in that deciding, I fell asleep. In the morning, there was a voicemail notification. I looked at it while I was making coffee. I put my phone face down on the counter. I made the coffee. I drank about half of it. Then, I picked up the phone and listened. The message was 2 minutes and 17 seconds long. I know this because I listened to it twice and then checked the timestamp before I put the phone back down. She sounded like herself, which is the first thing I noticed, not shaken or crying or doing any of the things I had half expected from a 3 a.m. call from a person I had not spoken to in 3 years. She sounded like someone who had thought carefully about what she was going to say and had practiced the beginning of it, and then somewhere in the middle had stopped following the script and was just talking. She said she was sorry for calling at that hour, that she had started to call earlier in the evening and talked herself out of it twice, and then at some point it had been 3 a.m. and she had stopped talking herself out of it. She said she didn't expect me to pick up, which suggested she had perhaps counted on me not picking up. She said she had been thinking about something for a while and needed to say it, not for any particular reason and not with any particular expectation, just because not saying it had started to feel like something she was carrying that didn't belong to her anymore. And then she said the thing she had called to say, which I am not going to reproduce here in the way that you don't reproduce certain private things, but which was honest and specific and true, and which arrived in my kitchen at 7 in the morning with the particular weight of something that had been true for 3 years and was only now being said out loud. And then she said she hoped I was well. And then the message ended. I put the phone face down on the counter again. I finished the coffee. I went to work. Her name is Jade. We were together for 4 years, which ended 3 years ago, which means I have now spent as long not being with her as I was with her, a fact I have thought about more than I would prefer to admit. We ended in the specific way of things that end not because something went dramatically wrong, but because 2 people who had been building something realized, with different timing and at different levels of acceptance, that what they were building was not going to become what one of them needed it to become, and that continuing to build it was an act of faith that one of them could no longer sustain. She could not sustain it. I understood why she could not sustain it. The understanding did not make the ending less complete. The 3 years since had been years in which I had constructed a life that did not particularly reference her, which is both more and less possible than it sounds. I had moved to a new apartment in a different neighborhood. I had changed the gym I went to. I had, in the way of someone who understands that presence can be a way of holding on, removed myself from the places where I might encounter her accidentally, which in a city of several million people is less dramatic than it sounds, but which required some deliberateness. I was not, in any active sense, pining. I had dated. I had done the thing people do when something ends, which is to slowly become someone who is further from the ending than they were, which is not the same as healing, but looks similar from the outside, and eventually, if you do it long enough, starts to feel similar from the inside. What I had not done, and what the voicemail made visible to me by existing, was stop thinking about her entirely. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way of someone who had failed to move on. More in the way of someone who had moved on but retained, somewhere in the back of whatever I was building without her, a specific awareness of her that I had decided not to examine too closely, because examining it would require deciding what to do with it. I had filed it under things that were true but not actionable, and had left it there, and the voicemail had opened the file. I thought about calling back for 5 days. This is not entirely the timeline I would choose to have, but it is the accurate one. 5 days of making coffee and going to work and coming home, and occasionally picking up my phone and putting it down, and thinking about what she had said and what I would say if I called, and whether calling was the right thing, and what calling would mean, which is a circle of thinking that goes around many times without arriving at anything new, but that serves the purpose of confirming, each time around, that the thing she said in the message was something I needed to respond to. By day 5, I had confirmed this sufficiently. I called. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was the same in the way that voices are the same, the specific frequency of a person who you have known well enough to know their voice from the first syllable without the phone saying who it is. She said, "I wondered if you'd call." I said, "It took me a few days." She said, "I figured." I said, "How are you?" She said, "I'm good. I'm actually good." I said, "I'm glad." She said, "I know you are." There was a brief silence of the kind that happens between people who know each other well enough to know what the silence is doing. She said, "I'm sorry for the 3 a.m. I said, "I was awake." She said, "I know. I saw that you saw it ring." I said, "You have read receipts on for calls?" She said, "That's not a thing. I just assumed." I said, "You assumed correctly." There was a small silence. She said, "I meant what I said in the message." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know what I expected you to do with it." I said, "I'm not sure either." She said, "I just needed to say it." That made sense to me. Some things need to be said, and the saying of them is the whole point, and the response is a separate question. We talked for an hour, not about the message specifically, not in a way that pressed on the thing she had said for a reaction I was not ready to give, but in the way of two people who had known each other for 4 years and had been out of contact for 3 and were now in the same phone call finding out what was still there. There was more still there than I had expected, which I could not have expected, because I had not been thinking about what was there. I had been thinking about what was not. I asked about her work, which she had changed in the intervening 3 years, in a way that made sense for who she had always been. She asked about mine. She asked about my family, which was a specific kind of question because she had known my family and had specific information about them that only 3 years of not talking could make into new information. We did not talk about why we had broken up. We did not talk about what the message meant or what the call meant or what any of this was. We talked about everything except those things, and the talking about everything except those things was its own form of talking about them. When the call ended, she said, "I'm glad you called back." I said, "I'm glad you left the voicemail." She said, "I almost didn't." I said, "You told me that in the message." She said, "It was still almost." I said, "I know." We said goodbye and hung up, and I sat in my apartment for a while after the call ended, thinking about the specific quality of the hour we had just had, which was the quality of something that had been sealed being carefully reopened, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the slow and deliberate reopening of something that had been closed and that was now, apparently, possible to open. She called me 3 days later, in the evening this time, which was the specific inversion of the 3 a.m. that told me something. I picked up immediately. She said, "Is this okay?" I said yes. We talked for 2 hours. The pattern of the calls established itself quickly and without any formal discussion, which is its own kind of conversation. She called on Tuesday evenings. I called on Saturday mornings. Occasionally, one or the other of us called on a day that was not one of those, and the other one picked up and neither of us commented on the deviation, because commenting on it would require naming what the pattern was. And naming what the pattern was would require deciding what we were doing, and we had not yet decided what we were doing. What we were doing, I understood, somewhere around the 4th or 5th call, was finding out whether 3 years had changed the specific problem that had ended things, or whether the 3 years had simply been 3 years, and the problem was still the problem. This is a question that sounds simple and is not simple, because the problem had not been a simple one. The problem had been this. Jade had needed, at the end of our 4 years together, a clarity from me about what we were building, and where it was going, and whether I was certain of it. And I had not been able to give her that clarity, not because I did not love her, but because I could not locate the certainty she was asking for, and the absence of the certainty was its own answer, which she had recognized before I had, and acted on before I did. She had needed me to know, with the specific kind of knowing that requires no qualification, that she was the person I was building toward. I had not known that. I had known I loved her. I had not known the specific thing she needed me to know. 3 years is a long time to carry a question you have not resolved. I had carried it without particularly examining it, filed under things that were not actionable, but the filing had not closed the question. it had just stored it somewhere I was not looking. The voicemail had taken the file out of storage. The calls were me looking at it again with 3 years more information than I had before, which is not the same information but is relevant information. What I had learned in 3 years, or what I was in the process of understanding as I learned it, was that the absence of the certainty she had needed had not, as I had more or less assumed at the time, been a characteristic of me as a person who was not capable of that certainty about anyone. It had been a characteristic of that specific moment, that specific version of myself, that specific understanding of what I was doing and what I wanted. 3 years of building a life without her had taught me things about what I actually wanted that I had not known. I was learning, and what I was learning in the calls was that what I wanted was specific, and that she was part of the specificity. I am making this sound cleaner than it was in the experiencing of it. In the experiencing of it, there was a significant amount of uncertainty about whether what I was feeling was real or was the specific sentimentality that comes from reconnecting with someone who was significant to you, which can produce feelings that resemble love without necessarily being it. I had conversations with my friend Dev about this, who had known both of us during the 4 years and who had also not spoken to Jade in the 3 years since, which meant he was coming to these conversations with old information and new skepticism. He said, "Make sure you know the difference between missing what you had and actually wanting what you'd have now." He said it in the particular way he said things that were true and relevant and slightly uncomfortable. I said, "I'm trying to." He said, "That's the right answer." He said it without confirming that it was sufficient. By the 6th call, I had understood something that I had been working up to understanding for several calls, which was that the question I had not been able to answer 3 years ago was a question I could now answer, and that the answer was yes, with the specific kind of yes that requires no qualification, and that the 3 years had been the time it took for me to become the version of myself who knew this, and that the voicemail had been her giving me the opportunity to say so if I had something to say. I had something to say. The question was how to say it. I did not call on Tuesday. She called on Saturday. I picked up, and she said, "You didn't call Tuesday." I said, "I know." She said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "I need to see you." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Okay." I said, "Not because I want to have a conversation on the phone about something that needs to not be a phone conversation." She said, "I understand." I said, "I just need you to know that I have something to say that is not a phone conversation." She said, "I know what you want to say." I said, "Then you know I have to say it in person." She said, "Yes." I said, "When are you free?" She said, "Next weekend." I said, "I'll come to you." She said, "You don't have to." I said, "I know I don't have to." I said, "I want to." She was quiet again. She said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." And then we talked for the rest of the hour about other things, because the practical thing had been established, and the important thing was going to wait for next weekend. And talking about other things, while the important thing waited, was its own form of the patience that the past 3 years had also been about. I drove to her city the following Saturday. She lived in a different city now than the one where we had lived when we were together, which I had not known before the calls, and which meant the drive was 3 hours rather than the 40 minutes it would have been before. I did not mind the 3 hours. 3 hours is a good amount of time to think about what you are going to say when you arrive, and I had been thinking about it for several days and had refined it to something that was honest and direct, and said the thing that needed to be said without asking more of the moment than it could carry. I had not written anything down. Writing things down for this kind of conversation felt like preparation for the wrong reason, like I was managing my way through something that needed to be present in rather than managed. I just knew what I wanted to say, in the specific way that things you have been carrying for a long time become clear when you finally decide to put them down. She met me at a coffee place near her apartment. Not her apartment, not yet. She had chosen neutral ground, which I understood and appreciated as the correct instinct. She was there when I arrived, already with coffee, and she looked like herself in the way she had always looked like herself, which was exactly the way she had sounded on the voicemail, like someone who was fully and specifically Jade and had been Jade for the entire 3 years. I had not been talking to her, which sounds obvious but is the specific obvious thing I needed to see in person to be certain of. I sat down across from her and she said, "You drove 3 hours." I said, "Yes." She said, "You could have said this on the phone." I said, "I could not." She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Okay, say it." I said it. I said it as directly and as clearly as I had worked out how to say it in 3 hours of driving and several days of thinking, which was that the thing she had said in the voicemail was the thing I had needed to hear, not because it changed anything about what I felt, but because it gave me permission to say what I had been carrying in the P. Filed under not actionable place for 3 years. And what I had been carrying was that I knew now what I had not known then, which was that she was the specific person I had been building toward, and that the certainty she had asked for and I had not been able to give had been real. It just had not been ready, and that I was sorry it had not been ready in time to save us the 3 years, and that if she was willing, I would very much like the chance to be certain in a way she could feel, rather than only in a way that I knew. She looked at me across the coffee shop table for what felt like a long time and was probably 20 seconds. She said, "You drove 3 hours to say that." I said, "Yes." She said, "You couldn't text?" I said, "No." She said, "I know." She said it with the small, specific smile that I had known for 4 years and had apparently retained in the unexamined memory of a person who claims to have moved on and has in most ways, but in this specific way, has not. She picked up her coffee cup. She said, "I left that voicemail because I needed to say what I said, and I wasn't expecting anything from you. And then you called back and I thought, okay, something is happening. And then there were the calls. And I started to understand that you had something to say, that you were working up to saying, and I've been waiting for you to say it." I said, "How long have you been waiting?" She said, "Since about the 3rd call." I said, "That was over a month ago." She said, "You needed the time to be sure." I said, "I am sure." She said, "I know." She said it the way she had said "I know" in the voicemail, not as an accusation, as a fact. She said, "I wouldn't have left the message if I wasn't sure of something myself." I said, "What were you sure of?" She said, "I was sure that I had been carrying something that didn't belong to me, and that the person it belonged to was someone I had spent 3 years not saying something to, and that it was time to say it regardless of what you did with it." I said, "I did something with it." She said, "I see that." And then she drank her coffee, and I drank my coffee, and we sat in the coffee shop near her apartment in her new city and talked for 3 hours. I drove home that evening with the specific quality of tiredness that comes from a day that used a lot of you in ways that mattered. The 3-hour drive back felt different from the 3-hour drive out, which is how drives feel when something has changed in the middle of them. I thought about the voicemail, which I had listened to twice in my kitchen 3 months ago, and which had turned out to be the beginning of a 3-month process of finding out whether something that had been put away was actually done or had just been stored. I thought about the 5 days before I called back, and the 6 calls, and the Saturday drive, and the thing I said across the coffee shop table. I thought about what she had said about carrying something that didn't belong to her, and about the person it belonged to, and I understood that the voicemail had been a way of returning something to me that I had not known I was missing, which was the specific knowledge that she had felt. At the end of 4 years, something that I had not been certain enough to hold on to, and that the something had survived 3 years of storage and had been handed back to me at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday in October, through a voicemail I had listened to twice and then gone to work. We have been figuring this out since then. Not the relationship, not yet. We are not there yet. And we are both careful about saying that we are before we are. Because one of the things the 3 years, and the calls, and the coffee shop conversation have produced is an understanding that careful is not the same as afraid, and that taking time to be sure is not the same as not being sure. We talk. We are talking in the specific way of 2 people who are finding out what is still there and what is new, and what the relationship between those 2 things is, which requires the actual time it takes and cannot be shortcut. She came to my city last month. I went to hers the month before. We are in the middle of something that began with a voicemail at 3 a.m., and that has not yet arrived at its conclusion, and I think that is exactly where we are supposed to be. What I have thought about most in the months since the voicemail is the 5 days before I called back. Not with regret, exactly, but with the specific awareness of someone who understands that the 5 days were necessary and that they were also a kind of reckoning. I had needed the 5 days to decide whether the voicemail was something I was going to respond to or something I was going to file and leave in the file. The fact that I called back means I chose the former, but the 5 days were the time it took to make that choice honestly rather than reactively, and I think the honesty was necessary. She had said she didn't expect me to pick up the call. She had said she had started to call earlier in the evening and talked herself out of it twice. We had both, in our separate cities and our separate nights, needed the time that we needed, and the time had been the 3 years and the 5 days and the 6 calls and the 3-hour drive, and the thing at the end of it had been there the whole time, in the file under not actionable, waiting for both of us to decide it was. She texted me Tuesday evening, which is still Tuesday evenings. Some patterns establish themselves, for good reasons. She texted, "I found the recording of the voicemail. I had not known she recorded it." I texted back, "You kept it." She texted, "I almost didn't. I said something about that." She texted, "I almost didn't make it either." I held my phone for a moment in my apartment and thought about the 3 a.m., and the watching it ring, and the going to sleep, and the voicemail notification in the morning, and the 2 minutes and 17 seconds, and the 5 days and everything that had come after. I texted back, "I'm glad you did." She texted, "I know, I put my phone down." Outside the window, it was late autumn. The leaves doing what leaves do, in the specific ordinary way of the world, continuing while the important things happen inside it. And I thought that the most ordinary Tuesday evenings, the ones where nothing particular is happening except two people texting each other things they already know, are the ones that turn out to matter most. There are things I want to say about what it is like to receive a 3 a.m. voicemail from someone who was significant to you and who you have not spoken to in 3 years, because I think the experience is more specific than it sounds, and the specificity matters. The specificity is this: it is not, in the first instance, emotional in the way you might expect. The first thing it is a fact. There is a fact in your phone that was not there before, and the fact has a timestamp and a duration and a name attached to it, and all of that is specific and real before anything else is. I had a voicemail from Jade. 2 minutes and 17 seconds. I looked at this fact for several minutes before I listened to it, and what I was doing in those several minutes was deciding whether I wanted to add more facts to the fact I already had, which is a choice you have with voicemails in a way you do not have with calls. With a call, you decide in the seconds while it rings whether you are going to pick up, and the deciding is fast and instinctive, and you live with the consequence immediately. With a voicemail, you have as long as you need. You can listen to it in the morning, you can listen to it a week later. You cannot listen to it at all, in which case you are choosing the specific absence of the fact over the fact itself, which is also a choice, and one that tells you something about where you are, if you pay attention to what it tells you. I listened to it in the morning with my coffee, and I made the choice to have the fact in full, rather than in the partial version I already had, which was that she had called at 3 a.m. and left a message. The full version was 2 minutes and 17 seconds of her voice and what her voice said, and having the full version changed things in the way that having full information changes things, which is that it gave me something to respond to rather than something to speculate about. I could have speculated about why she called for many days and in many directions, but the voicemail replaced the speculation with the actual reason, which was that she had something she needed to say and had chosen 3 a.m. and a voicemail as the way to say it. And understanding that this was a choice she had made deliberately told me something about what the thing she said meant, which is that it was the kind of thing you say after careful thought and in a form that gives the other person room to respond or not respond, which is a generous way to say something difficult. Dev said, when I told him about the voicemail, that it was the most Jade thing he had ever heard of, and I agreed with him. She had always been someone who thought carefully about the form that saying things took, about what the right form was for a given situation, and 3 a.m. and a voicemail was, in its specific way, exactly the right form for what she was trying to do. She had chosen a time when I would likely be asleep and therefore unlikely to pick up. She had chosen a form that gave me control over when I heard it. She had said what she said in a way that did not demand a response, that explicitly did not demand a response, that was structured as a thing being returned rather than a request being made. All of this was deliberate, and all of it was her, and the specific care of it was part of what the voicemail said beyond what it said. "I have thought about the 'I know,'" she said in the coffee shop when I told her I was sure, and I think that 'I know' might be the most important thing she said, more important even than the thing in the voicemail. Because the 'I know' meant several things simultaneously. It meant she had known that something in me was working towards something she had been waiting to hear. It meant she had been patient with the working toward it. And it meant she was not surprised when I arrived at it, which is a kind of faith that I did not deserve given the 3 years, but that she had extended anyway. The 'I know' was the continuation of the voicemail, which had been a form of patience, which had been a form of faith in the specific kind of knowing that I had needed more time to arrive at. She had left me the message and then she had waited. She had answered the call and then she had waited. She had sat across from me at the coffee shop table and she had said, "Say it," and then she had waited. All of that waiting had been for me to arrive at something she had known was coming. And the 'I know' was her telling me that the arrival was right on time. Not late, not 3 years late, right on time, because it was the time I needed. I do not know exactly where this is going. I want to be honest about that, because honesty about where things are is one of the things I have been working on. And this story is not at a point where I can say what it will become, only what it has been. What it has been is a 3 a.m. phone call and a voicemail, and 5 days in a call, and many calls, and a 3-hour drive, and a coffee shop, and something said plainly, and something received with the 'I know' of someone who was not surprised. What it is now is 2 people in 2 cities figuring something out together, which is a specific and ongoing thing that has a texture to it that I did not have access to in the 3 years before the voicemail, and that I am now trying to be present in, rather than to manage or to plan for or to handle with the kind of careful filing that had served me in the 3 years, but that is not what this requires. What this requires, I think, is the thing I had not been able to give 3 years ago, which is certainty. And what I have learned in the 3 months since the voicemail is that certainty is not a thing you arrive at before you are in something and keep throughout it. Certainty is something you keep choosing each Tuesday evening and each Saturday morning and each 3-hour drive, which is both more and less than I had understood it to be when I did not have it, and she needed it. I choose it now. I chose it in the coffee shop. I chose it in the 5 days between the voicemail and the callback. The 5 days were the time it took to be sure I was choosing it and not reacting to it, which is exactly the difference she had needed from me 3 years ago, and which I could not have told her at the time. She texted this morning before I was up. I saw it when I checked my phone, which I check now the way people check things when the checking is a pleasure rather than an obligation. She said, "The leaves are doing the thing." She lives near a park with a particular tree situation that she has described to me in the calls, and the leaves were apparently doing the October thing in the specific way she had been anticipating. I texted back, "Show me." She sent a photograph. The photograph was the specific warm amber of October leaves in morning light, and I looked at it for a moment in my apartment on a Tuesday morning. Having gotten a 3 a.m. voicemail in October, and having not picked up, and having listened to it in the morning, and having called back after 5 days, and having driven 3 hours on a Saturday, and having said something plainly, and having received an "I know" in return. And I thought that this was the specific ordinary texture of something that was worth the 3 years it took to get here, and that the leaves were doing the thing, and that I was glad she told me. I have one more thing to say about the 3 a.m., which is about why I did not pick up. I was awake. I saw it ring. I watched it go to voicemail. I have been asked, by Dev, and by the version of myself that occasionally interrogates its own decisions, why I did not pick up, and the honest answer is that I was not ready to pick up. Not because I did not want to talk to her, but because 3 a.m. is a specific hour with a specific quality to it, which is the quality of things said in the absence of the daylight reasoning that governs how we usually present ourselves to the people we have known and lost, and I was not prepared for that quality at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday in October. I made the choice to let it go to voicemail and to hear what she had to say in the morning, with coffee, with the daylight, with the specific quality of readiness that morning provides. This turned out to be the right choice, for me, in that specific moment, and I think it was the right choice, in part because she had also made it the right choice by saying in the voicemail that she had not expected me to pick up. She had built the right not picking up into the design of what she was doing, which is consistent with how she does things, and which means that the voicemail and the not picking up were both part of the same careful structure that started with her talking herself out of calling twice earlier in the evening and ended with 2 minutes and 17 seconds of her voice in my kitchen at 7 in the morning. What I know now that I did not know in October is that she had left a recording of the voicemail. Not the notification itself, which disappears when you listen to it and then eventually from the system, but an actual recording she had made for reasons she has not entirely explained, and that I have not entirely pressed her on because some things deserve the room they occupy without being explained. She texted me about it weeks after the coffee shop, and I have thought about it since, about the specific act of recording something before you send it, or as you send it, or after you send it, about the particular uncertainty that would make you want to keep a copy of a thing you sent at 3 a.m. to someone you had not spoken to in 3 years. I think the recording is about what all recordings of uncertain things are about, which is the desire to have evidence of having done the thing in case the thing does not produce the result you hoped for. She recorded it so that even if I had not called back, she would still have the fact of having said it, would still have the 2 minutes and 17 seconds as proof that she had said the thing she needed to say, proof available to herself, if not to anyone else. This is something I understand now, in a way I could not have understood 3 years ago. I understand it because I spent 5 days with a voicemail on my phone before I called back, and in those 5 days, I listened to it twice and thought about it many times. And the thinking about it was partly about what I wanted to do, and partly about the specific courage it takes to say something at 3 a.m. to someone you have not spoken to in 3 years, without knowing what they will do with it. She had that courage. I am glad she had it. I am glad she recorded it. I am glad she texted me that she had it, so that I could know that somewhere in her apartment in her city, there is a file that contains 2 minutes and 17 seconds of her voice saying something she needed to say in the specific October of 3 years after we ended, which exists regardless of what happened next, and is its own small fact in the world, complete and permanent. I called her on Saturday morning, as I always do. She picked up on the second ring, as she always does. She said, "The leaves are still doing the thing." I said, "They're doing it here too." She said, "Good." I said, "Good." And we talked the way we talk on Saturday mornings now, which is the way of people who are figuring out what they have and are not rushing the figuring, and the leaves were doing their October thing, outside both of our windows, in both of our cities, and 3 years is both a long time and exactly the time it took, and I did not pick up at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday in October, and I am glad I did not pick up, and I am glad she called, and I am glad she left the voicemail, and I am glad I listened to it in the morning with my coffee, and I am glad I called. Back after 5 days, and I am glad for the calls and the drive and the coffee shop and the I know and the Tuesday evenings and the Saturday mornings, all of it, in the specific order it happened in, which was the only order it could have happened in and the right one.